Hi, everybody. I'm Netta Weinstein. I'm professor of psychology at Reading. I'm actually, this is a great second talk to give after Suzanne. So thank you for, I think, setting me up a little bit. I'm going to be talking about parent-child relationships and the role that motivational principles that come from the work that I've done in psychology, how they feed into the parent-child relationship and technology within it. So I think it'll surprise nobody in this audience that technology plays an increasingly important role in parent-child relationships. Some positive and very close connections with children that revolve around technology use. And they also have some serious concerns at times about children's technology use. A lot of what we kind of start thinking about then is what this means for conversations and interactions that parents and children have around technology. And so there's a sort of challenge for parents about how to interact with their kids around technology, especially given the ever-changing technology that we're talking about, and how they might talk to kids if they have concerns about their behaviors. So kind of recognizing this, researchers have over the past 15 years built up a pretty kind of careful classification of parental mediation strategies. So basically different ways that parents talk to their kids or interact with their kids around technology use in children. And I won't go through all of them because I could really give a 2-hour talk just on that. But actually I'm going to use that a little bit as a launching point. But I just wanted to kind of quickly go over them so we can kind of think about them throughout the rest of my talk. So the first is co-using, basically meaning that parents or caregivers and children will play together or watch together. And the findings on this are kind of surprising in that, some meta-analyses, so basically reviews of the science so far, suggest that co-use might actually be correlated with more problematic children's use in technology, which is kind of a surprising finding. At the same time, there are potential benefits like learning more from technology. So it's sort of unclear right now what co-using with children does in terms of affecting their own behaviors. Another approach that parents take in terms of relating to their kids' technology use is restricting. So this involves limiting access or the amount of technology that can be used by kids or having specific rules about usage. And the meta-analyses, the reviews of these approaches say that essentially this is a pretty effective way to limit potential harm and risk of technology access. But at the same time, it has a sort of dangerous underbelly. It can create a sense of the forbidden fruit. What as a young person is out there that I don't get access to, and kind of some intrigue around what would it look like if I did. And there's also some concerns that it limits children's own ability to self-regulate their behaviors online. The third one, monitoring, is kind of related. It's in the same category of sort of using rules and restrictions. In this case, monitoring is more about checking the content of what children are doing online, checking where children are at or young people are at in terms of their geography. So essentially technologies and parental practices that are more about the parents having a high level of knowledge of what their young people are up to. And there's some evidence that it has protective benefits for children, what children are then exposed to in terms of potentially dangerous content online. But the effect sizes, so I won't talk too much about effect sizes in this talk, but essentially how robust that is kind of a question mark. They're not very strong effects. So they're not entirely successful endeavors. And the same is true with restriction. And the two of them kind of work in similar ways, and that monitoring as well can have a sort of backfire effect of creating a rebellion. And the final one is different. There are different words to sort of describe this that have emerged across the years, but essentially active mediation, which is more about negotiating and communicating with kids to sort of work with them to build their online and technology practices. Or even more recently, there's been a focus on educating kids so that they can be independent in terms of regulating themselves. And so you kind of, well, I'm a motivation psychologist and my background and worldview says that's the one I like. But actually the results for it are mixed. So it's not actually as big a success story on the whole in terms of whether it reduces kids' time spent on screens and whether it reduces their exposure to dangerous content on screens. There's some meta-analyses that show that actually restriction and monitoring are maybe more effective approaches. So all of these kind of have this intriguing thing of like, well, they're not really clearly good and they're not really clearly bad. So there's some kind of questions to ask about that. So they focused on these different exchanges between parents and children. And so as a motivation psychologist, they get really intrigued about, well, what does that mean for not just the rule that we set or whether we're setting a rule, but rather how do we set it? So my talk is actually going to be about that part. Essentially, what is the motivational framing, the motivational context for these kinds of mediation strategies that might change the way that they're received by young people? And that's where kind of a lot of my interest lies. So I'm going to use two words that we've talked about already today, and also are the title of this fantastic workshop that Katya has organized. But I'm going to use them in slightly different ways, I think. So I just want to make sure to define them clearly, and I also welcome questions. Either feel free to jump because the rest of the talk won't make sense if we're not on the same page. So you can jump in and ask me about them, or maybe it'll become a little clearer. So in kind of motivational science, we talk about autonomy and control in general in terms of parent-child relationships, but they have a slightly kind of different tone. So any type of sort of autonomous framing can be applied to any behavior, including one that is really restrictive. When we tend to think about restrictions and monitoring, we jump straight to control. But actually, if we think about the autonomy-supportive framing for that restriction or that monitoring, we would think that it's a restriction that, while it might be a rule that's applied by a parent, when the parent does it, they're ensuring that the child still has some sense of personal volition, some sense of being choiceful, even in their restrictive behavior, which sounds kind of bonkers, especially for adolescents, but could happen theoretically, and that it's sort of aligned in some ways with their values and interests. So it's actually about the young person then standing behind the decision that their parent has made, which again, as a parent, I find a very exotic idea. And so parents can kind of do this by offering their kids as many choices as possible when they, let's say, set a restriction, supporting their values and interests and trying to understand those values and interests to do that, offer a meaningful rationale, that's the technical term, but basically giving a really good explanation or a set of explanations for why the restriction that's applied or why monitoring technology or monitoring behavior is really important. And more recently, so a lot of the talk will focus on this one, really listening to young people about these kinds of restrictions, what they mean to them, and how they might be received. And we can sort of contrast that by control the way that maybe I as a psychologist would use control, which is feeling more imposed on, in the sense that there's no choice, the behavior is not volitional, and it might be a form of punishment, or sometimes children might be controlled in a way that's more about the rewards. So basically I do something because it's entirely external to me. It's being forced upon me by someone else. So we can take that same behavior, restricting technology, and if parents are conveying shame, guilt, or judgment around it, if they're making very inflexible demands around the way that restrictions are going to go, if they don't use global heuristics for action, which basically means they have an idea coming in that maybe a certain technology is scary or dangerous, and they apply that without understanding the child's perspective around it, and they offer no choices, essentially, that's going to set a controlling motivational context for restrictive behavior. And this talk might go long. I'm going to try. I'll try not to do the psych lectures for too long because I do have some results too. So basically, that then affects the child, and a child could cooperate with a restriction, but they could do it for either more autonomous reasons or controlled reasons. So some autonomous reasons is, well, these rules kind of make sense to me. Like, I don't always like them necessarily, but I get why they're there and why they might personally benefit me. I understand why they're important. I even help you choose how they're going to be implemented. So I was part of the process. Whereas controlling cooperation might be, well, I guess we're doing this restriction thing, but it's because I really don't have a choice in the matter, or I'd feel judged or ashamed if I didn't cooperate, or I'm scared of my parents. I don't think that's technically in the motivational literature, but I kind of like that as an example. And so there's a lot of kind of evidence that if in general parents are more autonomy supportive versus controlling, it's going to lead to a lot of good outcomes in terms of kind of how the young person receives it. Autonomy support helps to foster a sense of well-being. It helps to create a sense of closeness and intimacy between people. It helps to elicit cooperation and reduce the likelihood of we call it two things, defiance or reactance. Basically, I'm going to do more of the thing you don't want me to do because I'm kind of pissed off right now. It helps to foster responsible decision-making and generally linked to the kind of performance that parents want to be seeing. So there's kind of like a broad literature in general that shows that this kind of autonomy supportive framing might be helpful. And there are many ways then to implement it. And I'm just reiterating here because I've talked about a lot of these in the example, but basically when we support a young person's sense of agency and volition, even in making restrictions or monitoring behavior, it's experienced in very different ways, or it could be, let's find out. And so I want to show you a couple of studies that I hope help to illustrate this point. But to me, these studies are sort of the first in what could be a huge line of work. I think this is really early stages for asking these kinds of questions. So this one study is an experiment that I conducted with 1,000 British adolescents, and we're looking at 14 and 15-year-olds. And really, adolescents, I think these kinds of principles are interesting throughout childhood, but I think adolescence is a really intriguing context, life context, because it's a time when kids are starting to want independence and to be separate from their parents, to do their own thing. They don't like rules as much as, or they don't accept rules as much as they used to. And potentially we see more of this kind of defiance happening in adolescence. And, ooh, that is tiny text. So this is tiny text, but I'm going to give you a basic idea. This is actually the kind of scenarios that our participants read. And we basically just created a software that Robbie really wants to check out, social media software, AppMe, and Robbie's mom is concerned in this scenario about kind of exposure to this social media platform. And so we then said, well, mom wants this behavior to kind of be put on pause for a little bit while she can kind of figure out what the potential risks and dangers are. And she communicates this to Robbie in a number of ways. And I know this is really tiny, but the neutral comparison was just, hey, Robbie, can you hold off a little bit on this? So just asking him to stop. In the autonomy supportive, she then gives a clear and sensible reason why it would be helpful for him to stop. She shows understanding and she listens as she does it. In an external control, so this is more kind of jargon, but in an external control, that's sort of the most controlling. I guess she kind of becomes angry and threatens punishment if Robbie were to disobey and kind of log on before she's ready. And in the introjective control, that's that sense of shame and guilt. She tells Robbie that she'd be very disappointed if he kind of didn't wait. So we use these different motivational framings. And I just want to highlight that as I show you a picture, which when I looked at it yesterday, I was like, that's kind of a scary picture. So I'm going to give it to you in pieces. So this is kind of the first little piece. So here, what I'm doing is I'm just contrasting each one of these motivational framings with having no motivational framing at all. Like, hey, Robbie, just hold off a little bit. So we can see whether motivational framing helps or hurts. And we have here the autonomy support condition, the kind of shaming and guilt condition, and, I'd be very disappointed. And the external control, I'll be very angry if you kind of don't obey me. And what we looked at is then we looked at how adolescents would perceive themselves if they were in Robbie's situation, and whether they would first feel a sense of reactance, like, wow, I would be really annoyed and kind of want to do the opposite of what my mom just asked me to do. And that's that reactance circle right there. And then perceived trustworthiness is also the perception that adolescents had that actually I would feel like my mom's really trusting me in this moment by doing that. And what we found is, so when you look at autonomy support, you see that as compared to kind of having no motivational framing, when moms had this kind of sense of explaining and listening and understanding, that it reduced reactance and increased perceived trustworthiness. So that's these kind of dark, gray is not related, dark is related. So essentially providing this kind of autonomy support helped to kind of protect the relationship while setting this rule. Introductive control, this sense of kind of shaming and guilt, well, that still elicited that reactance, like, wow, that really makes me want to do the opposite of mom wants. It didn't affect perceived trustworthiness. So kids didn't feel that they were less trusted. They just kind of felt annoyed and like they want to do the opposite. And external control then affected both. It increased that sense of reactance. So that kind of like, I'm going to punish you, things will be bad. And it reduced the sense that young people had that they were being trusted by their parents. So motivational framing kind of changed the experience, in this case, adolescents projecting themselves into the scenario that they had. And as a result, those adolescents that we surveyed said, I'd be more likely to conceal that I'm actually already on this from my mom, which was their final outcome. And so kids who were more reactive were like, yeah, I'd log on right away. I'm not going to wait, and I'm not going to tell her about it. And those who felt less trusted also were more likely to do this concealing. So this is just kind of illustrating this is a hypothetical kind of set of scenarios, but it's illustrating the parent-child dynamic and the way that young people and adolescents, especially in this case, might feel when parents use different motivational strategies to set a restriction or rule. Recently, I've been really interested in the role that listening. Got it. Okay, I have 1 minute left. Plays. I think listening is a really important thing that we could do with young people to support kind of like healthy self-regulation around technology, healthy communication between parents and young people around technology. And so I won't go, actually ask me about this listening model if you want to later, but these are good things to provide to young people, and it really helps them to feel understood, valued, and choiceful when parents and young people are talking about tech use. I'm going to skip the way that we measure these things, but I just want to show you maybe a couple of things. The first is these are just correlations between young people's perceived listening and how they feel about the mom who listens in this case. And sorry, it's mom only for methodological reasons, but I don't think it's a mom-specific phenomenon. But essentially here this is a video or a very, very still mom. We looked essentially at how kids who perceive more listening felt connected, and that's that sense of relatedness need to their moms, and found that the more listening, the more connection. The more listening, the more that sense of my autonomy need is satisfied, which means I feel choiceful, I feel like I can express myself fully and I can be myself. It then translates to a sense of well-being in young people, which is really an important outcome that we often don't talk about, as well as their desire to disclose more. So again, that other side of concealment, to disclose more to mom in the future. And recently, we've been applying these principles to understanding how parents are using educational technologies with their young people at home. And this is kind of coming out of research that has shown that we've been doing recently and that others have been doing, that has shown that, you know, the importance of educational technology and kind of building fun learning and intrinsic motivation. But basically here we asked parents about their I'm thinking about my 1 minute. Parents' attitude toward technology, as well as children's perceptions that parents are actively mediating and listening. And the kind of takeaways when you look at kids, both sense of autonomy, sense of relatedness, and sense of competence around tech use. And we're talking now about tech use that is used to inspire education. So it's kind of like very family, parent-friendly technology use. Then in general, we're not seeing very strong links between parental attitudes toward technology and the sense of children's autonomy. So it doesn't really matter if a parent is afraid or feels negatively about technology in terms of how autonomous a child feels with educational technology. Active mediation also didn't link. So the extent that my parent kind of is curious and wants to talk to me about and have these conversations, but the extent that kids felt like they were really listened to around technology and that their views were elicited and they felt understood, those were key things for children feeling a sense of autonomy with their tech use. The same thing translated to connection with parents while they're using technology. And the only weird thing is somehow more fearful parents had more connected kids. I can't explain that one, but something about I feel incompetent around technology makes kids be like, yeah, I feel close to my parents. But that's a different, we won't go there. The effect size is quite strong for listening as well, I guess I want to highlight. And it translates then to competence around technology use as well. So generally, I think listening is an area that we really need a lot more understanding around because it's really important. So just a few ongoing gaps in knowledge. Does listening actually help? So I think building that listening research, what autonomy-supportive strategies really help kids to feel understood? I think feeling understood is a key mechanism. How do parents support autonomy when kids don't self-disclose? So one of the tough things is, well, if a child is actually doing something online that they're not talking about, and the parent kind of has these suspicions or worries in these tense relationships when the children are not well behaved, how do these motivational principles then apply? Is there kind of a role for specific strategies? If listening is a sort of specific strategy that parents can use, are there other ones that we can identify that really help to implement things like restrictions and monitoring of technology? Autonomy support is hard. It's especially hard when parents are tired or stressed, or their kids are kind of being difficult. And so we always have to understand that in the real world, these principles become more complex and implementing on these values becomes more difficult. So how can parents be supported in having healthy mediation strategies with their young people, I think is a really important question. And wow, context matters. And part of that is understanding mediation strategies, but within a broader relationship that exists between any two individuals or any family unit, within a broader cultural context with its own norms and expectations, which affect both the young people and the parents. And I think that's it for me for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Netta. This is fascinating. I'll have to very slightly cut the Q&A. So but we do have 5 minutes for Q&A. Caroline.
Hi, thanks so much. That was fascinating. As a parent, I'm really interested in it. Can you help me understand a bit more about that model of listening? What does that actually entail?
Yeah, so one of the things about kind of listening is that it requires, so when we listen to, we often will listen to a child because we want to find out the truth from them. So part of what listeners provide is really high quality attention, but the child also has to feel that there's a positive intention in it. And I think the kind of dynamics of helping me versus controlling me, actually, this is what I was like really intrigued by that as a contrast, because I think that positive intention is really about a parent listening with love and value, and they're trying to understand the child rather than find out information from the child. There's a lot more that we need to know about that. And then part of listening is comprehending. So a parent asks, for a child to talk about their technology use, and the child is then talking about it. The parent doesn't remember those things or doesn't really understand what the child's trying to communicate, even with the intention, or even if it's done with a lot of love, it might not be really effective. So it sort of has these three components of both attending with love and valuing, and then understanding what is important to the child in that moment.
Susanna and then John.
I thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I have two questions. One relates to this one. One of those first slides, when we're looking at this restriction, monitoring, and providing more autonomy. I was just wondering why there wasn't like this parental style of not really doing anything.
Yeah. Well, I think actually deference, so it's not on there, but it's a kind of active mediation strategy, is about educating. So I guess there's a sort of neglect model. Which is, there's a sort of like independence, helping kids to build independence model. And it could be that it hands off, like, I don't know. Actually, that's a good question.
No, because I realize that I might be this. I don't see myself as neglect.
Yeah.
But somehow I had lots of freedom as a child. I could read stuff that wasn't appropriate for my age, and I think I done out well. So I don't really control my kids. I feel guilty about that, but I don't.
Yeah, I don't know if
I just find that I didn't find myself.
Yeah, I think that is that kind of active mediation. I think a little bit has that the way that researchers are now thinking about active mediation is more moving in that direction of hands-off approach. Whether you start hands-off and hands-off, and by the way, as a parent, also like that. Zero judgment, but it's interesting. These are all about what parents do. They don't ask what parents don't do. I think the reason I brought those up is all of them can be done in controlling or autonomy supportive ways, in my view, including active mediation. I think you could have very controlling active mediation if you're not asking the right questions. I think in a family that has high levels of control, that kind of sort of independence model or neglect or whatever you call it, that might lead to, so that's where the broader relationship context might really matter, because in a parent-child relationship that really empowers the young person and then gives them, an iPad and leaves them to it, you might still see these healthy behavioral patterns that translate from everyday life.
I think I have to just one more question because but this coming over here and everything. John.
So I was really interested how you sort of segregated autonomy into a number of considerations. And I wonder how, and also one consideration was whether the restriction of the request makes sense for the child. So I just wanted to ask you how you handled this case. Say there's parents who've got a son and a daughter, same age, all other things equal, but they treat them very differently. So the son gets a lot of freedom, they're not subject to any surveillance, they can stay out as long as they want, etc. The daughter is subject to a lot of surveillance, a lot of restrictions on her movement, etc. Okay. But the daughter's like, that makes total sense to me. Because she's imbibed a sexist ideology that says that women require forms of supervision and so forth and restriction that men do not. Would it follow, in your view, that they are equally autonomous? Because in her case, it makes sense to her. She totally endorses it and stands behind what's going on.
Yeah, that's a really intriguing question. I think that's that's research that probably should be done. I think probably what you'd see, and I'm just kind of thinking about broader context research. I think what you might see is that she's not really endorsing it or volitional about it in a really kind of like agentic, like, this is great, like, this is really in line with my values and interests, but it might be more kind of like compliance. So I'm minimally complying. And it might be that she would cooperate, but she might not have a sense of well-being on the same level. So I think there's some nuanced outcomes and questions that can be asked. But I think certainly the broader family dynamic and how it lives within culture makes a difference. Whether it can protect from like clear inequality, perceived inequalities, I'm actually really doubtful that it can, or it can in some ways, like you might not see reactance from her or be less like, you might be less likely to see reactance, but you might see still lower sense of well-being and self-esteem, happiness, those kinds of things. So I guess that it's a nuance.
That is the point that, so therefore she would have equal autonomy, but she'd lose out on another scale.
I don't think you'd get high. I kind of feel like she might be low in autonomy and maybe even low in control.
Right.
Like she would just be in a helplessness state. That's my complete guess. But my guess is that for real agency, it needs to not just be okay, but actually be completely, in line with who you are. And it's hard for me to imagine anybody feeling that it's in line with who they are to be heavily restricted, especially in an unfair context.